one of the most feared and notorious methods of execution, which was used in England and in Britain, was to be hanged, drawn and quartered. This was a horrific ordeal for a condemned prisoner to be subject to, and it was reserved for the most serious crimes. It was used for high treason, plotting to overthrow or even kill a monarch, and because of this, the criminal was publicly shamed first, being drawn behind a horse, before they were then hanged on a gallows until nearly dead, then quartered and beheaded. The practice was used to serve as a very strong warning to any possible traitor to think twice about their actions, and the remains of an executed individual would often be displayed in public places, such as London Bridge. Join us today as we look at one of history's most brutal execution methods, and remember to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. To be hanged, drawn and quartered was a very serious punishment, and possibly one of the most brutal administered in history. The punishment was seen as adequate justice for the attack on the authority of the English monarchy, and for this, the most extreme form of punishment was used. Treason as a crime had a rather wide meaning for the kings and queens who felt threatened during the medieval, Tudor and following eras. Henry VIII, for example, believed that simply predicting the death of a monarch was enough for someone to be condemned for this, and he had Elizabeth Barton, a woman who did this, executed for treason. But there were accounts during the Elizabethan period of a number of treasonous plots against the Tudor Queen, and because of this, scores of men were executed being hanged, drawn and quartered, following the plans to put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne, in schemes such as the Babington Plot. Hanging, drawing and quartering in its simplest form was an execution method that used a number of different stages aimed to inflict great pain and suffering, but also aimed to shock the public. The point of this was to get the public to fall into line, and if they saw a brutal execution, they would be less likely to commit crimes such as treason because of it. The first part was a drawing, in which a prisoner would be collected from their place of incarceration, and then attached using a hurdle or a wooden frame. They would be tied to this, and then would be attached to the back of a horse, who would draw them through the streets. Sometimes the prisoner would not be tied to the wooden frame, and their head would bash against the cobbled streets, and they could also slip from the frame, and this would cause pain. They were paraded throughout the streets, where the public would often throw things and shout obscenities their way, before they were taken to a place of execution. They would be then handed over to an executioner, and would be hanged from a gallows or a wooden frame, until they were almost dead. If someone passed out, they would be revived, and some executioners, to inflict more suffering, would then hang them again. After this, the person was then disembowelled and emasculated, with their entrails pulled out, and then burned in front of them on a fire. Obviously this could easily kill, but often condemned individuals were forced to watch their parts being burned in front of them. They were then beheaded using an axe, and their body was cut into 4 pieces, with these being sent to different places in a country to be displayed, to act as a gory reminder of the people to behave themselves. Heads were also displayed in prominent places such as London Bridge after the execution. During the 13th and 14th century in England, those who were found guilty of treason were punished in many different ways, including drawing and hanging, but also more brutal ways such as beheading, disemboweling and even burning were used. It was said in the 13th century that a man who plotted and attempted to kill King Henry III was dragged asunder, then beheaded, and his body divided into 3 parts. Each part was then dragged through one of the principal cities of England, and afterwards hung on a gibbet, used for robbers. The first recorded examples of hanging, drawing and quartering were used during the reign of Edward I. Dafydd ap Gruffydd turned against Edward I and declared himself the Prince of Wales, and for this he was captured and then sentenced to what we would regard as high treason. Because of this, Dafydd was drawn through the streets of Shrewsbury near to the Welsh Marches, where he was then executed. He was dragged attached to a horse's tail and then hanged alive, before being revived and then disembowelled, eviscerated, and he was forced to watch his entrails being burned in front of him for sacrilege in committing his crimes in the week of Easter. After this, his body was cut into quarters for plotting to kill the king, and his remains were sent to different parts of England to be displayed as a gory reminder to the people to fall into line. His right arm was sent to York, left arm sent to Bristol, right leg to Northampton, and left leg to Hereford, with his head placed on a spear at the Tower of London. William Wallace in 1305, the Scottish knight and military leader, classed as Braveheart, was also executed in London following his capture in a similar way, and he was forced to wear a crown of laurel leaves as he was drawn through London to Smithfield, where he encountered the brutal punishment. Further executions in this manner occurred during the medieval period, but treason had not officially been outlined in law until the Treason Act 1351, which was passed by Edward III. This claimed that a monarch's right to rule was absolute, and that any questioning of this was seen as treason. It was also the monarch's duty to protect their throne and lands, and petty treason was also introduced, which outlined offences such as killing a lord or a master, and men found guilty of petty treason were drawn and hanged, and women were also burned at the stake. But it was high treason which was deemed the most serious offence. The Treason Act said that anyone was committing high treason if they committed a number of different offences. These were compassing or imagining the death of a king, his wife or eldest son and heir, violating the king's wife, his eldest daughter, if she were unmarried, or the wife of his eldest son or heir, levying war against the king in his realm, adhering to the king's enemies in his realm, giving them aid and comfort in his realm or elsewhere, counterfeiting the Great Seal or Privy Seal or the king's coinage, knowingly importing counterfeit money and killing the Chancellor, Treasurer, or one of the king's justices whilst performing their offices. With this, hanging, drawing and quartering was seen as a standard sentence for these offences. The execution of the 3rd Duke of Buckingham outlined his sentence in brutal fashion. He was executed in May 1521, and it was said he would be laid on a hurdle and so drawn to the place of execution, and there to be hanged, cut down alive, your members to be cut off and cast in a fire, your bowels burned before you, your head smited off, and your body quartered and divided at the king's will, and God may have mercy on your soul. During certain executions which featured a very angry crowd, they would often get involved in the killing process and shaming process. William Wallace was whipped and attacked by the crowd with rotten food, and rubbish was thrown at him. And a priest, Thomas Pilchard, who was executed for being a Catholic priest, it was said at the time, was barely alive when he reached his execution, before he was hanged, drawn and quartered. After the king's commission and the sentence of death had been read out, the crowd were then asked to move back from the scaffold, where the brutal practice was performed. Sometimes executioners or officials would ask questions to get the condemned person, following their drawing, to confess to their treason, and they were sometimes allowed to speak to the crowd. Often, other condemned people would be forced to watch others being executed in the same way beforehand. For example, in 1584, priest James Bell was forced to watch his friend being quartered. It is debated at what point someone would be dead along the process. Drawing, as mentioned, was very dangerous itself, often resulting in a prisoner's head being smashed against the ground. A victim may be conscious at the part of the ordeal where his entrails were burned, shortly before the head was removed and the body cut into 4 bits. It was said that during the execution of Major General Thomas Harrison, a man who signed the death warrant of King Charles I, that he was alive for several minutes after being hanged, and then when he was cut open and disembowelled, he then allegedly tried to hit the executioner, and because of this his head was cut off quicker. During disembowelment, John Houghton, it was said, began to pray before the final part of his ordeal occurred. One of the most famous people to be hanged, drawn and quartered was Guy Fawkes, one of the leading men involved in the gunpowder plot. Fawkes had been caught guarding the gunpowder in the undercrofts of the Houses of Parliament, and after his torture, which involved the rack, he was hanged, drawn and quartered. However, Fawkes jumped off the scaffold before in one final act of defiance, and its claim broke his neck before the sentence was carried out. The practice of hanging, drawing and quartering continued for centuries, and the accounts of them were very brutal. It was abolished in England by the Forfeiture Act of 1870, just over 150 years ago, which is shocking, considering how terrifying the practice was. Hanging and posthumous beheading replaced the old disembowelling and quartering in 1814, but it was still very brutal. The last hanging, drawing and quartering was of David Tyree in 1782. He was a Scotsman who had been caught corresponding with the enemy French. It was said of his execution, from the time he was put on the sledge till he came to the gibbet, he continued in an unconcerned conversation with the jailer, in which he expressed that he thought there were not 3 better, sounder, or honest hearts in the kingdom than his own, which was going to be burned. That there was only one thing which gave him concern, which was that his father was living, and he feared this misfortune would bring grey hairs with sorrow to the grave. He never hung his head the whole time. When arrived at the place of execution, no halter was provided, upon which he smiled and expressed astonishment at the inattention and neglect of his executioners, and indeed the business would have been slowed for some time, had not a rope and pulley been procured out of a lugger that lay upon the shore, during which time he read several passages in a Bible he carried in his hand. After hanging exactly 22 minutes, he was lowered upon the sledge, and his sentence literally put in execution. His head was severed from his body, his heart taken out and burned, his privateers cut off, and his body quartered. He was then put into a coffin and buried amongst the pebbles by the seaside, but no sooner had the officers retired, but the sailors dug up the coffin, took out the body, and cut it into 1,000 pieces, each one carrying away a piece of his body to show their messmates on board. A more dreadful, affecting execution was perhaps never seen. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was certainly one of the most sadistic execution methods used throughout history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.